Hello, welcome to this ReedsyLive chat session. Hopefully you can all see me. My name is Michael Rowley and I'm a fiction editor working freelance. Prior to going freelance at the beginning of this year, I was editorial director for Del Rey, the Penguin Random House UK science fiction and fantasy imprint. And before that, I was at Waterstones Booksellers for 15 years, half of which I spent as a head office fiction buyer, where I specialised in all sorts of things, but genre fiction being my main thing. And it's been almost 20 years now in the book trade for me. So today we're going to be talking about world building, and I'm going to give you some tips on how to apply them to your fantasy and science fiction novel, and a little bit on mainstream fiction as well. So, world building. Well, start off, talk a little bit about what is world building. And at its core, I guess we could say it's most easily explained as the setting or the landscape of your novel. Often it's described as being almost like a character in its own right in the book. And the relationship between world building and storytelling is absolutely vital and so important to any novel, and in particular, science fiction, fantasy are well known for these areas. It's there to support, reinforce, and help bring life to your central story, and facilitate the plot at the same time. As I said, science fiction and fantasy are well known for these, for the obvious reasons that they deal with worlds that are not our own perhaps, or different versions or future versions of them. But as I said, it's important in all forms of fiction. In SF and fantasy, though, I mean, you've got your obvious major authors there that spring to mind. J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, being one of the biggest of them. George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones series, of course, is phenomenal, and has some of the most intricate world building that I've ever seen in fiction, or anybody I think I've probably ever seen in fiction. We've also got wonderful authors out there like Trudy Canavan, Robin Hogg, Patrick Rothfuss, all doing wonderful and interesting things with their fantasy worlds. You've got authors like Ursula Le Guin, who of course have written in the fantasy world and the science fiction world, and she really very nicely bridges the gap in a way, because she's done quite a bit of both. You have authors like China Mayville, the wonderful Octavia Butler, Mervyn Peake, Doris Lessing, Margaret Atwood, William Gibson, Ian M. Banks, and Peter Hamilton, just to name a few of the authors that spring to mind when talking about SF and fantasy, all of whom have built wonderful worlds, wonderful ideas, and really, push the genres on in a terrific way. So, as an author, you've probably got two major types of people when it comes to world building. You've got the planners, who they work out everything on paper about the world, the land, the environment, all those kind of things. They might spend huge amounts of time on it, have books full of notes, even computer models of worlds and things like that you can get. And of course, this is all terrific stuff. Of course, there is a slight danger in that it's easy to plan and never actually get down to the actual writing of the novel, which I'm sure there's many people who've found themselves, being wonderfully productive and working on their world building, and then of course never finding constant reasons to delay actually writing the novel itself, which is always something to watch out for. As it's very easy to get distracted and forget about the story and the plot and the characters that you might want to get on with and use all this wonderful backstory. The other main type of author, I guess, is the kind of the more make it up as you go kind of author, and that's equally valid way to go. I think some people don't want to sit down and write notes and do lots and lots of research and build their world. They just want to get on. They've got an idea, they've got a character they love, and they want to get on with it. Obviously, the main danger with that route would be you're probably going to have a lot of revision at the end of the book. You know, you're going to have more difficulties with continuity and making everything line up. So that's a little thing to watch out for there. What I'm going to do now is talk about a few of the big ideas of world building, some of the main points, the things that people talk about a lot. And the first of those we're going to talk about is location. Obviously, that's the most obvious thing, and that could be the time, the place. It could be our world. It could be another world. In fantasy fiction, we often talk about second world fantasy, which is just a phrase to differentiate between our world, Earth, or our version of it, differentiate completely separate or our version of it, fantasy world. And George completely separate, like Woodwright or Raymond Feist or Woodwright, all those kind of guys, or Raymond Feist or authors out there like Terry Brooks, whose Shannara books are sort of more or less definitely set in a very far future version of our world, and so when we talk about second world fantasy, it kind of gives you a bit of an out there, because you can do whatever you want with it in a way. You don't have to stick to any historical paths or rules there, but the real world, of course, being slightly more difficult. You've got geographical constraints there, historical specifics, technology, politics, all these kind of things that you'd want to incorporate in there. In science fiction, countless futuristic books are set on Earth, as well as other planets colonized, or alien worlds, etc. So everything from the far future to the near future to the alternate future or alternate reality, where you've got subgenres like steampunk, or wonderful books like The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, or even just your dystopian novel, which is of course extremely popular at the moment. So for your imaginary world, you're going to need lots of different things. You're going to need the backstory, its history, its geography, culture, species, language, environment, weather. Is it a forest world? Is it a desert world? Is it more or less like Earth? It doesn't have to be. It can be anything more or less you want it to be. If you're going to have humans or a version of humans on there, it's going to need to be something that can sustain human life. But you're also going to need to think about infrastructure, transport, all those kind of things. For an alternate reality, you'd want to think about the point of divergence. At what point did our history change a little bit, as the aforementioned Man in the High Castle? If the Germans and the Japanese won World War II, what would happen? What if? And then you need to think about, as part of your world building, what is the social impact of that? What would be the technological impact of that? Obviously, there's all sorts of things you could talk about along those lines. All of these are major things that you'll be wanting to consider when you're doing your world building. So another of the key areas, which we mentioned a few times just before, would be technology and science. Obviously, in science fiction, these are huge things that you're going to want to think about. Some people obviously build entire novels around those kind of books and ideas. I think, but even in fantasy or mainstream fiction, technology is an important consideration with world building. It needs to be realistic and well thought out and have an internal consistent logic to it. In science fiction, probably one of the most frequently talked about and looked at things is faster than light travel, and indeed faster than light communication. Ursula Le Guin created the idea of the Ansible, which is a wonderful sort of get out of jail free card for instantaneous communication over vast distances, which several authors have used, and it's become a sort of like a staple of the science fiction genre, and has no specific real technological sort of basis in fact, but it's nice and it's easy, and it solves a lot of problems if you need people to be talking to each other over vast distances. Obviously, you've got the archetypal Star Trek sort of warp speed, which is kind of quite specifically a Star Trek kind of thing, and again has a sort of fuzzy science to it. And then you've got the more sort of hyperspace, perhaps more, significantly based in science kind of ideas about how one might travel very, very fast through the galaxies and the universe. I'm not a scientist myself, and I suspect an awful lot of science fiction writers are, but also an awful lot of science fiction writers aren't. The hard science fiction writers, as we call them, meaning a specific technological or scientific basis in fact, or futurism perhaps. We'd look at people like Arthur C. Clarke, of course, who came up with the idea for geosynchronous orbiting satellites in his fiction. All sorts of interesting things like that. Alistair Reynolds, who is a wonderful scientist himself, worked for the European Space Agency and has some great ideas in his books. You've got other authors like Greg Egan, who's a computer scientist, I believe, by a day job, and writes some wonderfully complicated but inspired sort of scientific ideas. I worked on the book The Martian, of course, when I was at Del Rey, which was a great book that we published, and it became a Sunday Times bestseller and a Richard and Judy pick. And Andy is he's a computer science guy. He's spent a huge amount of time working on The Martian, researching things, everything about Mars that he could discover. And of course, he spent years and years doing that. He, I believe, designed computer models and all sorts of things to chart the trajectories of the spaceships and how long it would take to get from place to place. And of course, quite famously, when the film came out starring Matt Damon, directed by Ridley Scott, we had the fact that Mars was discovered to have water, and of course Mark Watney in the book spent a lot of time looking for ways to make water and gets a certain amount of peril and tense moments about that. And of course it's been discovered since that there is water on Mars, so he probably would have had an easy time of it. These are things that you can't account for, but it's worth having a look at. I think one of the alternatives, of course, is to go the route of someone like Ian M. Banks with his culture novels, where he sort of famously doesn't really explain anything technological. He does all sorts of wonderful things. He has droids with artificial intelligence that can morph into different things, spaceships where the walls move around, travel faster than light speeds, and he doesn't explain any of it. It's a conscious decision to go for the story and not focus on the technology. And of course, it is a terrific get out of jail free card for him. Obviously, he was a wonderful leading light in the science fiction genre, and it just proves that you don't have to know all the science, but I think if you're going to use the science and describe it, you really, really need to know what you're talking about. You need to check it out, because there are a lot of readers out there who will know all the ins and outs of it, probably a lot better than half the writers may do, and they will sort of call you on it. Technology and fantasy, of course, is also important. Are you going to have black powder weapons in there? Are you going to have steam power, magical powered things? These are all important ideas that you need to think about carefully, and all need to have a sort of consistent, internal logic. Moving on to magic is sort of a nice lead into that. And like science, if you're going to have a magical system in a fantasy book, it needs to have rules. It needs to, whether it's set in our world or a second world fantasy, it needs to have an internal logical consistency. There must be cause and effect, and there's lots and lots of fun you can have there with the effects of magic, especially on people who are using it. All sorts of interesting things. So magic systems, yeah. What are some of the great ones? David Eddings had The Will and the Word, which I grew up reading from 14, and I absolutely love that idea. It's a very simple idea. Doesn't really require a lot of scrolls or magical books or anything like that. It's an idea of imposing your will and using a power that you might have in a very specific way. Trudy Canavan, of course, has the wonderful guild system of magic in her series, and I think she's probably one of the leading lights of how one would use magic in a more sort of taught rules and kind of hierarchical fashion in a fantasy novel, and I'd highly recommend having a look at those. Patrick Rothfuss, of course, as well, is doing that wonderfully with his series of books, where you've actually got the main character retelling his story of how he went through the first 2 books, who went through his magical school of learning how to be that kind of sort of sorcerer and wizard. All of us patiently, of course, waiting for the next book. Raymond Feist as well, of course, had 2 nice, interesting, different sets of magic, almost sort of one world had one, and sort of the main world had a different version. So and then one character bridging the gap between those two worlds of magic. So you don't need to explain everything, but you must have rules, and you must stick to the rules to preserve the storyline and the plot. Game of Thrones is a really good example of where you don't need to, the Song of Ice and Fire series, where you don't need to actually explain everything. In fact, magic is so central, actually, and becoming more and more so to what's going on in that book and to perhaps the main, story arc. But he's not really big on explaining everything and how it works. And actually that works to build tension and build interest and anticipation. And I think he's just done a phenomenal job of that. And I think keeping people guessing is definitely a way to go. But again, you have to have a sort of a rule that you follow through, so you don't catch yourself out during the course of writing the book. But history, culture, language, and politics, these are all hugely important things to any novel, whether you're writing in the real world or in a completely created world of your own. Whatever your setting, history is very important. You need to have a handle on the past history of the world. In futuristic fiction, set in a version of our reality, you need to know what's happened between now and the book is set. In a second world fantasy novel, you really need to have an idea, even if you're not explaining the whole thing to the reader. You need to have an idea of the history of the planet and the cultures that you're writing about, just so you have, again, this constant, consistent thing going on. And indeed, in contemporary mainstream fiction, whether it's crime novel, thriller, a lit fiction novel, you really need to have a sense of history and indeed current events. Otherwise, you could end up writing something that, especially if it's including a country that you're not native to, that you may just get completely wrong, and it may just ruin the whole thing for you. So culture, again, in science fiction fantasy, this can be extremely interesting, as well as in mainstream fiction. But you need to think about the various cultures and races in the book. Obviously, in SF and fantasy, it's quite often people will use archetypes from history, myths and legends, Arthurian, Celtic, Norse, Aboriginal. I think the important thing to say there is, and we've got a question about this that I'll go into a little bit more detail, is not to be too familiar. You need to put your own stamp on things. And I think you need to shake things up a bit and have some originality and get creative with it. And again, there's lots of fun can be had there. Language as well is another hugely important thing. Again, especially in science fiction and fantasy. Some people kind of ignore the idea of language in those genres and essentially just accept the fact that everybody speaks the same language, whether it's, a fantasy world where everybody just happens to speak the same, or a future where maybe there's a sort of a standard galactic language has sort of reached supremacy. Again, to use the Star Trek idea, they have a translating device. Doctor Who with his TARDIS has a translating device. The TARDIS uses, so they can talk to anybody anywhere. But if you want to go, deeper and do more, I think it's a very interesting and exciting part of world building that you can get into. How would different races or species communicate? How would aliens talk to humans? AIs talk to humans or aliens? What are the common things that you could think about there? What if it was a mainstream novel and your protagonist goes to a foreign country? Are you going to automatically have them speak the language? All these things are hugely important to give the book a sense of reality and really get the reader, to believe in what you're doing there. So politics as well. Obviously, we're having an interesting time with politics in the UK right now, and no culture can really escape politics. If you're on a spaceship, if you're in an office, if you're on a ship on the ocean, you're going to have, or in government, you're going to have internal politics. You're going to have global politics. And I think to the basis of any realistic or believable culture or world or country or city or village or anything that you're going to create in your novel, you need to keep an eye out for opportunities to explore that. It's also a really good way of making the book relevant and socially conscious of what's going on. As I think I just mentioned before, in the last week or two, you couldn't make up what's been going on in the UK politics-wise. It's pure gold. If you could come up with something even half that good for your novel, whatever the setting, then you'd be doing some great stuff. I'm also going to mention characters. Sometimes people think about characters as being a different part to this, but I think characters have their own element of world building that you need to incorporate. Everything from the main protagonist to the basic secondary or third tier characters might need some fleshed out connection to the world they're in, and motivation, history, past connections, all these kind of things to make them properly believable. One of my favourite examples of this is Jack Reacher, the Lead Child books. In his first book, he creates Reacher in a really wonderful way. He's an American, but he's born abroad. He's lived on military bases most of his life, and so feels, certainly in the first few books, like a tourist in his own country. He visits a small town in America, almost like a Western style setting, which is geographically almost irrelevant to the story. But it feels real. He feels like he's, especially to an English person reading his book about an American, not being hugely versed in America, only having visited a few times myself. It felt real. It felt like a good way of an English writer, British writer, writing a book with an American character, but having the option of having him sort of see the world like a tourist might, which I think was a terrifically imaginative and obviously hugely successful way of writing a character. Patrick Rothfuss's main character, I'm going to probably butcher the pronunciation of his name, but I think it's Quoth, I think it is, or something like that. He is telling his story through the course of the books. We're several different time points through the novels, and he's giving us his backstory. His backstory is essentially the major part of the work, so you really need to focus on your characters as well. But so mainstream fiction, I thought I'd just lay a few little points about mainstream fiction. So it's not all just science fiction and fantasy. I've mentioned a few of these before, possibly, but you may feel when you're writing a mainstream novel, whatever its subgenre or type, that you don't need to worry about the world building as much. You're not writing science fiction, you're not writing fantasy. You don't need to go into huge amounts of effort and detail, and that's possibly quite true. But it does have its own challenges, and I think you need to be very careful about how you proceed with these things. If you want to make the book believable and enjoyable for the readers, you've got things like police procedurals. If you're going to write a police procedural knowledge, you really need to know about the police. You need to know how detectives actually work in the real world. You can take a certain amount of liberties, of course, and people do. But realistically, you need to probably buy the policeman's handbook that's for sale, for instance, that in the UK. And I'm sure there is lots of interesting information online, and all these things can be found and researched. But if you're going to have a car chase, have a car chase, but are you going to map out the route? How are you going to do that? Are you going to use Google Earth, Google Street Map? These are all really interesting. Where are the traffic lights? What are the possible perils? This is all part of world building and research. Technology in mainstream novels can be a tricky one. Are you up to date on the latest technology? Are you writing technology that doesn't quite exist yet? And if so, is that deliberate? Is it something that you might want to incorporate into the novel? Is it actually a major plot point of the novel? So you need to be aware of what's going on. You need to be aware of foreign travel, like I mentioned before. And if you're dealing with lawyers or specialist legal things, or engineering, or any of the kind of things that Joe Blogs on the street may not know about, then I think you need to pay attention to those things and include them in your world building sort of plan for the novel. We all work in different ways. There's no right or wrong way of doing things necessarily. But I think one of the things I'd say about world building is make notes. Do it in a notebook. Do it on a computer. There are lots of interesting apps out there, from Evernote to Scrivener and all these other things that you can use to collate information, if that's an easy way of doing it. A lot of people prefer still to use the old-fashioned notebook, which is great. If you're using a computer, back everything up. Sadly, I read that somewhere, and that's a very good piece of advice. Maps are fun for fantasy novels. They're not necessary, but I think most people who read fantasy novels quite like a map. But I also remember that it gives you a sense of distance and space and the geography of the land you're writing about. If people are going on a journey, having an idea in your head or a visual representation of what that actually might mean is quite important, I think. I think focus on the way the world needs to complement the story. Try and avoid doing it the other way around. Really, the story is the important. The story and the plot and the characters. The world building is there to help them, reinforce them, bring out the best of your ideas. Try not to just focus on the world building and then try and fit the story into that. That would probably be my best advice from that. And again, as we said, if you're complicated scientific ideas, or even not so complicated ones, if you're someone like me who's not particularly science-minded, make sure you do your research, seek advice. There's lots of people out there, forums and things, who'd probably be more than happy to give you advice on them. And of course, wonderful resources like Wikipedia and all sorts of online stuff. I'd also always remember to build into your worlds, elements of conflict, as I said, politics, whether it's local or global. Watch the news. Take some ideas from the real world. See how they can be adapted to fit your world, especially if it's a fantasy world. There's all sorts of interesting things you could use, which will make that idea of realism just so much better. And probably my last bit of major advice there is to keep reading. It's an obvious thing to say. It's probably a silly thing to say in many ways, but read as much as you can. Read quality books as much as you can. But whatever it is you're reading, be critical of it, analyse it, and have a good, well-rounded sort of idea of what's working and what isn't working out there in the marketplace. Maybe try and read something that isn't in the genre you're reading, just to have a bit of a break. But do always think about how people are doing things. And wow, that's really good. He did that brilliant, or she did that great in her book. I must have a try at adapting those kind of ideas to my story. I think that's a great way of learning. Again, probably an obvious thing to say, but worth pointing out. It's been a pleasure talking to you all. Hopefully that was of some help. And do check out the Reedsy website. It's terrific. Thank you very much.